Well, first let me say that it's such an honor to be here as part of this series. I was delighted to get the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here. So I'll be talking about political violence and political motivations. So I will first talk about the fact that recruits to most armed organizations, in fact, have quite diverse motives. Some of them come to an organization already with an ideological reason, but others come for other quite personal, sometimes quite idiosyncratic reasons. Perhaps they're bored, perhaps they're very socially isolated, perhaps they seek adventure, perhaps they seek a more meaningful life, a life of service. For whatever reason, they come to an organization, and then the organization has to build this set of very diverse recruits into an effective organization. So that challenge is it's the fundamental challenge that an armed group confront, and if it cannot manage that, then of course it will fail. It will not survive. And so I'll talk a bit about cohesion, that a group has to become cohesive enough that it doesn't suffer a series of splits. But what I'll focus on is the challenge that violence poses to an organization. It's not so easy to get a group of young people to wield violence for the purpose of an organization. So they may have their own ideas about the purpose of violence and what they'd like to do, but the organization has its own ideas about how to wield violence most effectively. And that means then that there's a difference in preferences between the strategists and the combatants, the members of the armed group. And there's also a difference in information. So once they're out actually engaged in violence, the combatants know what they're actually doing, but the strategists and the top-level commanders do not know. So there's an information asymmetry. So these two elements, the information asymmetry and this possible difference in preferences, means that the organization faces what social scientists call a principal agent challenge. So how organizations manage this is then the core part of the talk. How do you produce political violence in a way that is sufficiently controlled that the group doesn't self-destruct? Yeah, so the training I think we should think about in really three different kinds of training. So one is kind of technical, military training. How do you bear an arm? How do you work the arm? How do you clear the arm? Whether it's a Kalashnikov or an M16, whatever it is. And then there's the training that is about becoming a member of a group, having the kind of social cohesion in the field, whether you're a terrorist cell operating in a fairly dispersed way, or whether you're part of actually an army that has to move together across a field of combat. You must have that kind of social cohesion at this base level if the group is going to be effective. And that kind of socialization happens in two ways. One is that some of the training is actually not so much technical military training, but actually about forming those kinds of social bonds. And then, of course, that also has its informal dimension, the kind of social life of the armed group. But some groups also engage in quite robust, repeated, ongoing ideological training. Not all groups do it, but some groups do. And so that's another difference across these various kinds of armed groups that I'll be talking about. So I'm working on two books. One is a book on wartime sexual violence, and that's quite broadly comparative. So it's a theme I've been working on for quite a long time. So I'm asking why some insurgent groups engage in sexual violence against civilians and some don't, and why some state militaries engage in sexual violence against civilians and some state militaries don't. So the first thing that I do is to document the fact that there is such variation in the pattern of sexual violence during war by armed groups. A lot of the literature and the policy rhetoric seems to assume that all groups engage in rape of civilians, and that's not true. So departing from that, then I ask, well, what explains why some groups engage in widespread rape of civilians? Usually women, but sometimes men, and other groups don't. So that's one book. And the second book I'm working on, Colombia, and that is a book about patterns of political violence by the various armed actors in Colombia's very long civil war. It's been going on, depending on how you count, something like half a century. And in that, I'm working with a Colombian co-author named Francisco Gutierrez Sanin. So the conflict on which I worked most intently at the beginning of my career was the conflict in El Salvador. And what I did was I traveled out into the countryside, into contested areas of the countryside, and I sought out civilians. And I was always introduced to them by somebody that they trusted, and then I spoke with them about why they did or didn't support the insurgents, why they did or didn't support the government. So in that research, I was very focused on civilians and why in El Salvador, the areas where I was working, about a third of them ran very high risks to support the Salvadoran insurgents. Why would they do that? That was what I was working on. And so in that project, my principal research method was long interviews with groups of civilians or with individual civilians. And it was crucial to this that I repeated those interviews. So they would meet with me once, and we would have a conversation after I was introduced. I would then come back and we would talk again, and I would go back sometimes 5 times. And with each interview, the story became deeper, more complicated, and so on. And so that was the conflict that I worked on initially. I then worked on South Africa, and there I didn't go as deep into the patterns of local political support for the insurgents. There I was working on a more regime level, national level theme about the outcome of the South African conflict. And in my work since then, I've done 2 things. One is I've relied very heavily on colleagues in human rights groups and women's groups, to some of them attorneys, some of them sociologists, some of them people who come to their expertise as a result of their life experience. So, for example, I've met some incredible women who came to a position in a women's group because they had perhaps been displaced by violence from some area. They had refounded a household, and then they became a political activist and eventually founded a women's group or a human rights group. So they're very expert, not as a result of education, but as a result of their life experience. And so for this book, the comparative book on wartime sexual violence, I spoke with these organizations in several countries around the world to understand what the pattern of wartime sexual violence was in their particular conflict. More recently, I've been working on Colombia, and again, I rely on colleagues in various non-governmental organizations and also in government agencies. So, for example, in Colombia, there are very good statistics on the displacement. Between 5 and 6 million people have been displaced from their homes in Colombia. And the statistics are pretty good, kept by the government. There are also very good statistics, in this case, some kept by the government, some by independent researchers, for example, on massacres, and also some data on sexual violence. So in this case, then I talked to various agencies and organizations. But the principal way in which I'm gathering my own data is through interviews with former combatants. These are men and women who served either in one of the guerrilla groups in Colombia or served in one of the counterinsurgents paramilitary groups. And so I talk with them about their life history. So it's not the method I use is not a survey method. It's what in social science we call an oral history. And so once we're sitting in a quiet, private place, then I just ask them to tell me their story. And I ask a few other questions, but mostly they tell me their own narrative of their life history. So you're reminding me of one of the most moving encounters I had. This was in El Salvador. It was during the ceasefire that did eventually end the civil war, but at the time things remained very tense. And I was driving in a little pickup truck. Do you know a pickup? And I had left a small town, and I had directions that said I should drive up this dry riverbed about some miles, and that I would find this community up there. So I said, okay, I'll try. So I started up this riverbed, and after some trouble, because the road just wasn't really a road, it was a riverbed, I arrived at this community. And what I had asked is that a few members of the community come and talk to me about why they had supported a particular kind of activity during the course of the war. About halfway through the war, they had occupied land. So they had been working the land already surreptitiously, but at this point they declared themselves a cooperative, and they had occupied the land in the formal sense of writing to landlords, declaring themselves a cooperative, telling landlords that they were now the owners of this land, and so on. And so I arrived to ask them, in the very dangerous circumstances of the Salvadoran countryside, why had they done that? And as always, I told them that I did not want to know their names, that I just wanted to hear their stories. And yet, one by one, they came up to me and insisted that I write their names down. And they told me that they insisted on doing this, and in thinking about it afterwards, it was very clear to me that it was the pride that they took in having occupied this land. El Salvador is a country where there was a long-standing pattern of not just economic and social exclusion, but actually an attitude of people in the countryside who were poor, who had no land, who worked in very often itinerant kinds of roles, were treated not just as workers, but with contempt. And so for them to come to a point where they were occupying land and telling landowners that they were now the owners of this land, they took great pride in that. So it was very moving for two reasons. One was that they wanted me to know their story and wanted me to tell their story, but also that they wanted their names associated with this story. And because it was the pride that they took in the kind of agency that they had exerted despite the high risks.